Hey guys, it's Zynwavez. So today we're going to be starting a podcast that'll cover many topics and interests. For these episodes, I'll be referring to myself as Z-Man, and anyone that follows will have a name in this podcast. So, for our first episode, we're going to be talking about a book I read almost about 2 years ago, and it's about Chernobyl. I'm a big fan of all that stuff and how Chernobyl affected Ukraine. So, I wrote a fiction story about the events of Chernobyl. This story was created over a period of 12 or so months and took lots of typing to create. It was crafted by me, Z-Man, and just myself. Anyways, that's enough talk. So, how about we get into reading this book for the start of our podcast series? So the book that I crafted, the name is Chernobyl Stories, and it goes follows as this. Story written over a period of 12 months about Chernobyl. Real information was used for the story, but this isn't a documentary. This is a lesson. Episode 1. Not great, not terrible. Now this does in a part series, so we'll go episode, and per episode there's 4 parts. The reactor erupted like a bomb. A deafening crash reverberated through the building, followed by the relentless screech of alarms and the ominous hiss of steam racing down the hallways. The once dormant reactor building of Chernobyl's reactor number 4 was now a chaotic nightmare. The control room was a maelstrom of screams as operators shouted over each other, desperately trying to be heard over the shrill warnings of machinery. Dust hung thick in the air, drifting down from the fractured ceiling. Radioactive particles swirled through the corridors as walls crumbled, sending debris tumbling into the wreckage. The very structure of the reactor hall groaned under the weight of destruction, and outside the sirens of fire trucks howled through the night as they raced towards what would become the most infamous disaster site in history, Chernobyl. Part 2. The Worst Outcome. The flames engulfed reactor number 4, their raging tongues consuming everything in sight. Firefighters, unaware of the invisible death seeping into their bodies, battled tirelessly to suppress the inferno. The acrid taste of burning metal filled the air, accompanied by the foul stench of melting wires and charred debris. Toxic fumes snaked their way into their lungs of anybody nearby, leaving an unbearable tickle in their throats. Some firefighters unwillingly picked up chunks of graphite scattered across the ground, deadly remnants of the reactor core. The radiation clung to them like a silent predator, invisible but lethal. The air inside the building was thick with aromatic gases, an unseen specter of death roaming through the ruined halls. Part 3. That isn't possible. In the wake of catastrophe, a team of investigators scrambled to uncover the truth behind the explosion of reactor number 4. Determined researchers in Kiev sifted through every possibility, searching for an answer to an unfathomable question. How could an RBMK 1000 reactor explode? The deeper they dug, the clearer the truth became. Human error was the obvious culprit, but it was not the only one. The RBMK 1000 was a flawed creation from the start, a product of Soviet cost-cutting measures that prioritized efficiency over safety. In their relentless pursuit of budgetary constraints, engineers had stripped essential safety systems from the reactor. It was built cheaply, with compromises that turned an already complex machine into a ticking time bomb. The very design of the reactor spoke for itself, a relic of Soviet ambition and the inevitable downfall of reactor number 4 and perhaps Chernobyl itself. Part 4. Human or computer error. The world had never faced a disaster like Chernobyl. Operating a nuclear reactor required years of training, preparing operators for every conceivable scenario during standard operations. Computers controlled nearly every aspect of the reactor, with human intervention only necessary for startup, shutdown, or emergencies. However, on the night of April 26, 1986, human intervention would seal the fate of reactor number 4. A management safety test was underway. A routine experiment meant to prove the reactor could maintain power in the event of a power failure until backup generators engaged. This was not the first attempt. The test had already failed 4 times, and the shift manager was determined to complete it. His career and a possible promotion depended on it, but delays had pushed the test back nearly 10 hours. By the time the night shift took over, the operators were untrained for the task at hand, and they were about to make a critical error. Episode 2. The Fatal Test. Part 1. The test begins. The night shift crew arrived at Chernobyl, ready for their routine duties, unaware they were about to become part of history. The shift manager ordered them to begin the safety test, brushing aside their concerns about inadequate training. With only 15 minutes to breathe themselves, they hesitantly prepared the reactor, lowering power levels in accordance with test parameters. To prevent the computer from counteracting the test, they switched the reactor to manual control, but an unforeseen complication had already taken root. The test delay had created a xenon pit, a buildup of neutron absorbing gas that would soon contribute to the explosion of reactor number 4. Part 2. 1:23:45. An hour and a half into the test, the reactor had reached the desired power levels. The shift manager, confident in his plan, stepped out for a cigarette, leaving his operators to carry out the simulation. Then the unexpected happened. Power levels began dropping at an alarming rate. One of the operators rushed to find the shift manager, reporting that the reactor had fallen below the test minimum parameters. His response was immediate: raise the power and continue. But by doing so, they sealed their fate. The reactor was now an unstable, a ticking time bomb, waiting to detonate. Part 3. The worst is yet to come. They knew the dangers of a xenon pit, yet they pushed forwards. For 45 minutes, they painstakingly raised power, just enough to conduct the test. As the final phase began, they cut power to the reactor and waited. 33 seconds into the test, the control room filled with warning sirens. Power surged out of control. Desperate operators tried inserting the control rods, but it was too late. The reactor exceeded its limits by 120 times. In a final act, desperate act, the AZ-5 shutdown button was pressed. Part 4. The worst has happened. The AZ-5 was supposed to be their salvation. Instead, it became the trigger for disaster. An engineer burst into the control room, screaming that the reactor's lid was bouncing off the containment hall. Then, the unthinkable happened. A thunderous explosion shook the building. Silence fell over the control room. No one spoke. No one breathed. Reactor number 4 had just detonated. Episode 3, Aftermath. Part 1, Confusion. The control room was a maelstrom of disbelief and fear. The shift manager, his face pale and drenched in sweat, refused to accept the reality before him. His trembling fingers clutched the console, searching desperately for an answer. A rational explanation, anything but the truth that loomed over like a specter. "It's the hydrogen tanks," he muttered, voice shaking. "A fire, a small explosion. We can contain it." One of the junior operators, his hands shaking as he adjusted his headset, turned to his superior. "Comrade Dyatlov, the reactor. It's gone." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Dyatlov's nostrils flared, his face twisting into something between rage and denial. "That is not possible. The reactor cannot explode." The rotogen meter on the wall flickered. 3.8 rotogens per hour, a manageable number. "Not great, not terrible," Dyatlov muttered under his breath, reassuring himself. But that number was a lie. A feeble mask hiding the horrifying reality. The real reading was thousands of times higher, lethal within minutes. The instruments were only capable of measuring up to 3.8. Down in the ruined corridors, the truth was evident. Burning graphite filtered the ground, pieces of the reactor core itself. The air shimmered with unforeseen death. Firefighters, unaware of the radiation seeping into their bodies, rushed past the control room, determined to extinguish the flames. Their boots crunched over what they thought was mere debris, unaware they were stepping on the shattered remains of the reactor's heart. Part 2. The Night of Fire. The flames roared as the firefighters battled the inferno. Their only thought to save the plant, to stop the fire from spreading. They had no concept of radiation, no protective suits beyond their standard uniforms. The smoke that filled their lungs was not just from burning steel and insulation, it was laced with radioactive isotopes, lodging themselves deep inside a silent death sentence. One firefighter, Vasily Ignatenko, scooped up a piece of what he thought was a chunk of metal. The graphite seared into his palm, the pain unlike anything he had ever felt. He dropped it instantly, but the damage was done. The radiation had already begun its work. Above them, the sky churned with a sickening glow, the colors unnatural, flickering with shades of blue and violet. Ionized air, a phenomenon none of them understood. In Pripyat, families stood on their balconies watching the surreal display. Children pointed in awe, oblivious to the invisible force seeping into their bones. As the hours dragged on, the men collapsed, vomiting, their skin reddening, blistering, their bodies were being torn apart from the inside, but still, they fought on. Part 3. Lies and Silence. By dawn, the fire was mostly contained, but the air reeked of something more insidious than smoke. The morning shift arrived, confused to find their colleagues missing, the plant surrounded by emergency crews. Yet, official orders remained the same. No panic, no evacuation. In Moscow, a crisis meeting was held. Soviet officials, bureaucrats, and scientists sat around a long table, staring at the reports with grim faces. "What do we tell the people?" one official asked. The response was immediate. "Nothing. We cannot cause a panic. The Western powers are watching. We contain it. Control the narrative." In Pripyat, life continues. Workers rode their bikes to the plant, unaware they were breathing in radioactive dust. Children played in the parks, their skin absorbing doses of radiation that would mark them for life. The city was a ticking time bomb. Meanwhile, in the hospital, the first wave of victims suffered in agony. The firefighters who had laid in first now laid in bed, their skin peeling, their bodies betraying them. Nurses tended to them, confused by the severity of their burns. No one had told them the truth. No one warned them. Part 4. The Evacuation. It was nearly 24 hours before the order came. Buses rolled into the city, hundreds of them. Loudspeakers crackled to life. "Comrades, for your safety, you must evacuate immediately. This is a temporary measure. You will return in a few days. Bring only essentials." Families gathered in the streets, clutching bags hastily packed. Many left behind treasured belongings, pets, heirlooms, believing they would be back. The thought of permanent exile never crossed their mind. The buses pulled away, a slow exodus from the city that would never see its people again. The roads leading out of Pripyat were lined with silent figures staring back at the place they called home, now a ghost town in the making. Inside the reactor, the core still burned, spewing invisible death into the sky. The world had changed in an instant, yet the full horror had only just begun. Episode 4. The Cover-Up. Part 1. Controlling the Narrative. As the evacuation of Pripyat was underway, Soviet officials in Moscow scrambled to contain the disaster, not just the radiation, but the information. The KGB intercepted transmissions, controlled phone lines, and silenced workers. The explosion of reactor number 4 was an unthinkable failure of Soviet engineering and leadership, and the world could not be allowed to see their weakness. At a hastily assembled government meeting, high-ranking officials and scientists sat in tense silence as they reviewed early reports. The reactor core was gone. The explosion had sent radioactive debris across Ukraine and Belarus. The worst of all, an open-air graphite fire raged, spewing radioactive isotopes into the atmosphere. One official, his voice low and measured, spoke. "We tell them it is contained. We tell them it is under control." A scientist, trembling as he adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat. "Comrade, the radiation levels. They are rising beyond our instruments' limits. We need international help if the wind carries us west." His words were cut short by a sharp glare. The General Secretary leaned forward. "The West will not be involved. We will manage this ourselves." Part 2. The Lies Begin. Meanwhile, in Pripyat, citizens sat in the departing buses, their faces pressed against the windows, watching as their home disappeared behind them. They were told they would return soon. This was the only precaution. None of them knew the truth, that their city was already lost. State media issued vague reports calling the incident a minor accident. Soviet news outlets declared the situation was stable. The public was assured that minor radiation leaks had occurred, but they were being handled. Schools remained open in Kiev, farmers continued working the land, and trains carried passengers under the radioactive sky, all unaware that an invisible threat surrounded them. But the whole world was watching. Across Europe, radiation meters in Sweden detected unusual spikes in background radiation. Confused scientists traced the contamination back to the Soviet Union. The alarm spread quickly, reaching Western intelligence agencies. Something catastrophic had happened in the USSR, and they were trying to hide it. The Kremlin denied everything. No explosion, they insisted. No radiation leak. Everything is fine. Part 3. The Silent Victims. In hospitals across Ukraine, the first victims of the disaster suffered in silence. Firefighters, plant workers, and first responders lay in agony, their skin blistered, their organs failing. The doctors treating them had no idea what they were dealing with. Radiation poisoning was not something they were trained to handle. No one had prepared for this. In Moscow's top secret medical facilities, the worst cases were transported under strict orders. Their families were not informed. Their suffering was concealed behind heavy steel doors, away from prying eyes. No records, no names, no official explanations. Only men dying in agony, their bodies betraying them as radiation consumed them from within. For those left in the contaminated zone, the situation grew dire. Entire villages near Pripyat remained unaware of the invisible death. Farmers continued milking cows, children played outside, and families breathed in the poison air, unknowingly sealing their fate. Part 4. The World Finds Out. On April 28th, the truth could no longer be hidden. Radiation alarms at the Forsmark nuclear power plant in Sweden detected extreme levels of radiation contamination, levels too high to be from any local source. Scientists quickly traced the origin, somewhere in the Soviet Union. Western media erupted with speculation. Intelligence agencies scrambled for information, and satellite images confirmed what the Soviet Union refused to admit: an explosion, a massive fire, and an ongoing nuclear catastrophe. The Soviet leadership had no choice but to respond. That evening, a brief news segment aired on Soviet television. A government spokesperson, reading from a prepared script, stated, "An accident has occurred at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The situation is under control. There is no cause for concern." But the lie was already unraveling. The world knew the truth, and the worst is yet to come. Episode 5. The Fire That Would Not Die. As the world began to uncover the truth about the Chernobyl, the fire at reactor number 4 continued to rage. It was no ordinary fire. This was a graphite-fueled inferno, releasing radioactive isotopes into the atmosphere with every passing hour. The wind carried deadly particles across Ukraine, Belarus, and beyond, a silent specter of contamination. At the disaster site, a new group of men arrived, Soviet helicopter pilots. Their mission was straightforward but deadly: drop thousands of sand, lead, and boron onto the exposed core to smother the flames and absorb the radiation. Flying over the reactor was akin to flying in the death itself. The radiation levels in the air were lethal, seeping into their bodies with every second spent above the burning ruin. The pilots watched in horror as the fire turned below them, glowing with an eerie blue light, Chernobyl effect, a visible sign of the ongoing nuclear reactions. Each sortie lasted mere moments, a drop of sand, then retreat, another approach, another low. But the fire did not die. It consumed everything thrown on it, defying their desperate efforts, and all the while the radiation continued its silent assault on those who dared to challenge it. Part 2. The Liquidators. With the fire refusing to be extinguished, the Soviet government mobilized a new force of the Liquidators. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, reservists, miners, and plant workers were drafted into the cleanup effort. Their orders were simple: remove the radioactive debris by hand, clear the site, and stop the spread of contamination. They were given crew protective gear, thin lead aprons, rubber gloves, and cloth masks that did little to shield them from the radiation. Some were given nothing at all. On the reactor roof, the most dangerous task awaited. Blocks of graphite from the destroyed core lay scattered, emitting lethal radiation. Machines had been sent to clear them, but the intense radiation fried their circuits within minutes. That only left one solution: human beings. In shifts lasting mere seconds, liquidators ran onto the roof, grabbed a chunk of radioactive debris, and hurled it over the edge. They had no time to think, no time to process what they were doing. The dosimeters screamed warnings, but they had no choice. One by one, they went up. One by one, they were sent home. Many would never recover. Part 3. The Poised Lands. Beyond the reactor, the Soviet Union was still waking up to the scope of the disaster. Entire villages, forests, rivers, they were all contaminated. The lush greenery of northern Ukraine and Belarus had turned into a radioactive wasteland. The Red Forest, a vast expanse of pines near Chernobyl, was the first to show those effects. The trees, once vibrant and green, turned a sickly, unnatural red within days of the explosion. The radiation had killed them where they stood, an eerie graveyard of silent witnesses to the catastrophe. Animals feared no better. Cows gave milk laced with radioactive isotopes. Birds fell from the sky. Packs of stray dogs, once beloved pets left during the evacuation, wandered the empty streets, their sates filled by the invisible poison in the air. Still, people refused to leave in the outskirts of the exclusion zone. Stubborn villagers stayed behind, unwilling to abandon their homes. Soldiers arrived, pleading with them to go, but many resisted. They had survived war, famine, and Soviet rule. They would not be driven out by something they could not even see, but the radiation did not care. Part 4. A dying reactor. Even as the Soviet Union fought to contain the damage, another crisis loomed. The molten reactor core had begun melting downward, scarring through the concrete base of the building. If it reached the water reservoirs beneath the plant, it would trigger a thermal explosion powerful enough to wipe out half of Europe. A desperate plan was formed. Miners from across the USSR were sent to Chernobyl. Their task: tunnel beneath the reactor and install a cooling system to prevent disaster. The conditions were unimaginable. The heat underground was unbearable, the radiation seeping into their bodies with every breath. Many stripped naked as they dug, sweat pouring from their bodies as they fought against time. They knew they were being sent to their deaths, but they also knew the alternate was worse. They worked tirelessly, and in the end, they succeeded. The cooling system was installed, and the worst case scenario was averted. But for the miners, their fates were sealed. Many would never live to see the impact of their sacrifice. As the fire above finally began to die down, the Soviet Union was left with a chilling realization: the battle for Chernobyl was far from over. The true cost had yet to be counted. Episode 6: The Ghost City. Part 1. Pripyat's Silent Streets. 2 days after the explosion, Pripyat was abandoned. Once a thriving city of nearly 50,000, it now stood eerily still, windows left open, food rotting on dinner tables. Children's toys scattered in the streets. The people had been promised they would return in a few days, but they never would. The air carried a strange silence, broken only by the occasional gust of wind rattling through empty apartment blocks. In the parks, the Ferris wheel stood motionless, a symbol of a future that would never come. The radiation, though invisible, was everywhere, but not everyone had left. A handful of people still wandered the outskirts, searching for lost pets or scavenging belongings. Some had refused to evacuate, unwilling to abandon their homes. Soldiers patrolled the streets, restricting and enforcing strict orders. Anyone caught inside would be removed, but the real enemy was time. The longer they stayed, the more the radiation seeped into their bodies. Part 2. The Soldier's Duty. As part of the cleanup effort, Soviet soldiers were ordered into Pripyat. Their task was grim: kill every animal left behind. Dogs, cats, even livestock had to be eliminated. They carried the radiation in their fur, and letting them roam risked spreading contamination. The soldiers hated their orders, but they followed them. Rifle shots echoed through the empty city, breaking the unnatural silence. Packs of stray dogs, once beloved pets, now roamed the ruins, unaware of their fates. Some soldiers found it too much to bear, turning away as others carried out the grim work. Even inside the buildings, the cleanup continued. Workers scrubbed walls, washed streets, and buried contaminated soil in mass graves, but nothing could erase the radiation. It had seeped into every brick, every road, every blade of grass. Pripyat was dead. Part 3. The Return of the Scientists. Despite the danger, scientists and nuclear experts entered the ruins, tasked with assessing the extent of the radiation. They moved carefully through the city, Geiger counters in hand. The clicking grew more frantic with each step closer to the reactor. What they found was worse than they feared. The radiation levels in some areas were beyond human endurance. Blackened trees in the red forest, toxic rivers, abandoned streets where standing too long meant a slow death. The reactor itself remained unstable, spewing radiation even as efforts to contain it continued. One scientist, his hands trembling, took a final reading and removed his mask for a brief moment. The air smelled the same, felt the same, but it wasn't. Death is in the air, he muttered, before quickly replacing his mask. Part 4. The reality sets in. Back in Moscow, the Soviet leadership struggled with a growing realization. Chernobyl was worse than anyone had admitted. Radiation had spread across Europe. Countries were demanding answers. The people were whispering, questioning the government's silence. But the Soviet Union had to maintain control. The official narrative remained: the situation is under control. Yet within their own reports, the truth was undeniable. Pripyat, once a model Soviet city, was now a ghost town. Reactor number 4 still smoldered, and the cost in human lives had only begun to be counted. For the first time, officials asked themselves a terrifying question: what if Chernobyl could never be fixed? Episode 7 The World Watches. Part 1 Whispers Beyond the Iron Curtain. The Soviet Union had done its best to contain the truth about Chernobyl, but the disaster could not be hidden. By April 28th, 2 days after the explosion, radiation detectors at the nuclear plant in Sweden had picked up alarming readings. The levels were too high to be natural, something catastrophic had happened. As Swedish officials pressed for answers, the Kremlin denied any knowledge of an accident, but satellite images told a different story. The Western world watched as plumes of radiation drifted across Europe, spreading fear and confusion. Governments scrambled to issue warnings, advising citizens to stay indoors and avoid contaminated food. Yet in the Soviet Union, the people still remained largely in the dark. Part 2. The Lies Unravel. At home, Soviet citizens were being fed a controlled narrative. State-run television went only brief mentions. State-run television made only brief mentions of the accident, downplaying its severity. The May Day parades just went ahead as planned, with thousands of people marching in the streets of Kiev, just 90 miles from Chernobyl, unaware they were walking beneath an invisible cloud of radiation. But the truth could not be silenced forever. Soldiers returning from the exclusion zone spoke in hushed voices of the horrors they had seen: the ruined reactor, the dying forest, the men exposed to radiation who were now unrecognizable in hospital beds. Families of liquidators received letters, some heavily censored, others filled with unfiltered accounts of the nightmare unfolding. Then finally, on May 14th, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev addressed the nation. His speech acknowledged the disaster for the first time, but then even he downplayed the severity, assuring the public that the worst was over. But the worst was not over. Part 3 The Sick and the Dying. In hospitals across the Soviet Union, Chernobyl's victims lay in agony. The firefighters who had fought the initial blaze had been the first to succumb, their bodies ravaged by radiation sickness. Their families were told they had died from burns, yet their skin had blackened and peeled away, their organs failing one by one. Others that had been sent to Moscow for treatment, but there was little to no doctors they could do. There was little to nothing doctors could do. The radiation had turned through their DNA, attacking them from within. Nurses wept as they watched young men deteriorate before their eyes, knowing they would never recover. For those still alive, the symptoms were worsening. Hair fell out in clumps, teeth loosened, skin cracked and bled, and the worst part was knowing. It would not be in days or weeks, but years before the full toll of Chernobyl was understood. Part 4 The World Responds. As news of Chernobyl spread, international press mounted. Western scientists studied the reports and their findings were dire. The Soviet Union had created a disaster unlike anything before, one that could affect the world for generations. Aid was offered. The Soviets hesitated, reluctant to accept help from the West, but as the crisis deepened, they had no choice. Experts from across the globe arrived to assess the damage. The reactor was still a threat. Its core smoldered beneath the rubble. The immediate crisis had passed, but the danger remained. And so as the world watched, horrified and helpless as Chernobyl continued its slow, insidious devastation. Episode 8 The Liquidators. Part 1 The Men Who Stayed Behind. Chernobyl would not be left to burn. The reactor smoldered beneath the twisted wreckage, spewing radiation into the sky. The Soviet Union called upon men from across the country, soldiers, engineers, miners, and volunteers, to contain the disaster. They were given one name: liquidators. They arrived in the thousands, their face hardens, their orders clear. Some would clear debris from rooftops, some would dig beneath the reactor, and some would sacrifice their lives without even knowing it. They were promised protective gear, but most received little more than lead apron and cloth masks. Some wore nothing but regular work clothes. Their only true protection was time. Their shifts were limited to seconds or minutes before the radiation would become fatal. They obeyed without question. Part 2 The Roof of Death. Atop reactor number 4, the situation was dire. Chunks of the reactor's core, graphite and uranium, littered the rooftop. The radiation was so high that even the best machines failed. The Soviet Union had sent in remote-controlled robots, but their circuits fried within minutes, so they sent men instead. The liquidators who worked the rooftops were called the biorobots. They had 90 seconds per shift, no more, no less. In those 90 seconds, they ran onto the rooftop, shoveled debris over the edge, and ran back before the radiation killed them. They could only do it once. No man was allowed a second shift. Some collapsed before they made it back. Part 3 The Tunnel Beneath the Reactor. As the clip continues, scientists feared another catastrophe. Molten nuclear fuel was sinking through, burying everything in its path. If it reached into water reservoir beneath, it would trigger another explosion, one that could render most of Europe uninhabitable. The only solution was to dig. Miners from across the Soviet Union were brought into town beneath the reactor. The work was brutal, stifling heat, suffocating dust, and ever-present radiation. The deeper they dug, the worse it became. Some worked in temperatures over 50 degrees Celsius, stripping down to nothing just to keep from passing out. They knew they were doomed. They dug anyways. Part 4. The Price of Contamination. For months, the liquidators worked. They cleared, they buried, they built. They erected the sarcophagus, a massive concrete tomb designed to seal the reactor away from the world. It was a temporary solution to a disaster that had no permanent fix. Many liquidators did not live to see their work completed. Some died within weeks, others would suffer for years, their bodies breaking down from the invisible poison they had absorbed. Officially, the Soviet Union recognized 31 deaths. In reality, the number was far greater. Chernobyl had been contained, but at an unimaginable cost. Episode 9. The Cost of Silence. Part 1. The Survivors. The liquidators had done their job. The fires were extinguished. The reactor buried beneath concrete, and Pripyat left to the ghosts. But the true damage of Chernobyl could not be contained. For the men who worked at the site, time was the enemy. Symptoms of radiation sickness appeared. Nausea, weakness, burns that refused to heal. Many who had been told they were safe began wasting away in hospital beds, their bodies ravaged from within. Doctors fought against the inevitable. Some victims survived for weeks, others for years, but they all shared the same fate. There was no cure for what Chernobyl had done to them. And it wasn't just the liquidators. Residents of contaminated areas began showing signs of exposure. Children developed cancers at alarming rates. Entire villages were abandoned as radiation spread through the soil, the water, the air. Part 2. The Trial. The Soviet government needed someone to blame. In 1987, a trial was held in a small courtroom in Chernobyl. A symbolic gesture in a disaster far too large for one any man to be responsible for. 6 men were charged with criminal neglect: plant officials, engineers, and the chef manager who had overseen the fatal test. They stood before a judge, accused of violating safety protocols, of failing to act, of causing the worst nuclear disaster in history. The verdict was predetermined. All were found guilty. Some were sentenced to 10 years of hard labor. Others received shorter terms, but no prison sentence could undo what had already been done. Chernobyl was not the failure of a few men. It was the failure of an entire system. Part 3. The Soviet cover-up. Even as the world pieced together the truth, the Soviet Union continued to downplay the disaster. The official death toll remained at 31, a number that ignores the thousands suffering from radiation exposure, the unborn children doomed to illness, the families shattered by loss. Scientists who spoke out were silenced, reports were rewritten, information was buried, just like the reactor. But the people knew, the liquidators knew, the family knew. The world was watching, and the Soviet Union could not hide from the truth forever. Part 4. A Dying Empire. Chernobyl had done more than poison the land. It had poisoned trust in the Soviet government. It had exposed the weaknesses of a system built on secrecy, on cutting corners, on silencing dissent. The people began to question more, to speak more, to doubt more. In 1991, just 5 years after the explosion, the Soviet Union fell. Chernobyl had not been the cause, but it had been a symptom. The disaster was proof that even the mightiest empire can be brought to its knees, not by war, not by invasion, but by its own failures. Episode 10. The Shadow of Chernobyl. Part 1. The New World. Chernobyl did not fade into history. It cast a shadow that stretched across generations. The exclusion zone remained frozen in time, a monument to the peace of human error and deception. Once it had been a place of life, families, schools, laughter. Now it's just a wasteland, overrun by nature where only scientists, explorers, and the ghosts of the past dare to walk. Yet the world had changed because of it. Nuclear policies shifted, safety regulations became stricter, countries reevaluated their dependency on nuclear energy. Chernobyl had been a warning, and for a time, the world listened. Part 2. The Children of Chernobyl. The fallout was not just radioactive, it was generational. Children born in contaminated areas suffered from thyroid cancer, birth defects, and immune disorders. Entire villages had been abandoned, but not before the radiation had seeped into the people, their bodies carrying the invisible scars of the disaster. International efforts sprang up to aid those who affected. Charities evacuated children for medical treatment, while doctors fought to understand the long-term effects of exposure. But for many, the damage had already been done. Chernobyl was not just a place, it was a legacy etched into their DNA. Part 3. The sarcophagus crumbles. The concrete tomb built to contain reactor number 4 was never meant to last forever. Cracks formed, radiation that has still seeped out. The world could not ignore it. In 2016, a new structure, the Chernobyl New Safe Confinement, was slid over the remains of the old sarcophagus, a technological marvel designed to last a century. It was humanity's latest attempt to lock away the past, but even it was just a delay. Chernobyl would remain dangerous for thousands of years. The disaster could not be erased, only buried deeper. Part 4: The Lesson. Decades later, the lessons of Chernobyl still echoed. The name itself had become synonymous with catastrophe. It was not just a nuclear accident, it was a testament to what happened with negligence, secrecy, and ambition collided. Some say it was the moment the Soviet Union truly began to die. Others say it was a wake-up call for humanity. Either way, the reactor still stands, silent and broken, a reminder that not all wounds can heal and not all lessons are learned in time. Because in the end, Chernobyl was not just a place, it was a warning. A global nuclear disaster, the worst in history. Chernobyl won't be forgotten. Thank you all for reading this. Let's remember this and learn from it. Goodbye. Written by ZMan. Well, guys, there it is. Chernobyl Stories, written by ZMan. A process of 12 months, 35-minute video. There you go. There's your podcast. Next episode will probably be released. So probably give it a week. Maybe Saturday next week. I'll drop a post. And I'll have another thing up for podcast. Let me know what you guys want down in the comments. Maybe I'll do a FNAF podcast. Anyways, thank you guys for hearing out my story, Chernobyl Stories by ZMan. This is ZMan going out, and I hope you guys enjoy my podcast. Goodbye.